Well, this certainly wasn't the plan. It looks like I have a two-part video about genre. I realized when I thought back and reflected on that first video, while I think I explained what a genre is fairly well, it's a way to categorize or label groups of things that are related. In this case, how we get books to be grouped together. I didn't really explain as much actual examples of different types of genre forms, although, I think some of you have an idea. But I figured it might be worthwhile to go through a few of them, especially because Mrs. McIntyre did hint that she is going to quiz you on some of these. So let's go forward and take a look at some of the different types. All right. So right off the top of this guy's head, not my head, you see some different genre types here: fiction, romance, fantasy, history, and so on. As you know, there are many different kinds of writing. And there are ways to even categorize them. I'm going to kind of zoom in on this. And this is a pretty simple chart, but I think a helpful one. Initially, you should always be thinking to yourself, is what I'm about to read, or maybe what I'm about to write, is it going to qualify as fiction, which is kind of that fake made up stuff, or are we talking nonfiction, which of course I like to think of as non-fake to make it easier, meaning real. So if I'm looking at the fiction side, again, you see what we group under there: fantasy, science fiction, historical fiction, realistic fiction, and even fan fiction. And then on the nonfiction side, narrative nonfiction, biographies, periodicals, self-help book, and even reference books can all qualify as nonfiction. This chart is a little more thorough, a little more. Again, we see the two headings. We basically have fiction books or nonfiction, which is nice. But then when you get into these sections, things can get a little more complex. If you look at folklore under fiction, for example, what are we seeing here? Well, there are fables, fairy tales, tall tales, myths, and legends. There are a lot of things that we really like to tell kids when you're young to teach you right from wrong, and sometimes just to scare the heck out of you, because some of those original stories are really scary. Let me get back in. On the nonfiction side, the list really goes on quite long for nonfiction. There's a lot of realistic stuff, real world information that we share. Even something like a pamphlet counts, or a guidebook, or even just down your notes, let's say, in English class. Those are good examples of nonfiction type of writing. Now, just to prove my point, to show you how complicated it really can get, this in the middle says fiction. And all around this drawing, I'm not going to get into it because even trying to zoom in doesn't help you, are different labels like things about historical fiction or fantasy or short story form or poetry. And off of these, I know it's really hard to see, but there are all these little branches and lines that explain all the different types of poetry that exist, all the different types of mysteries that exist, adventure stories, fantasy stories, whatever. There are a lot of different groups underneath a main group. So we have fiction, we have nonfiction, but then you can go into fantasy, and fantasy can turn into epic fantasy, where you're reading something like 20 books and it's a giant long story, a long history of some group of people, doing some type of magic or fighting some type of evil usually. But every one of these groups can be subdivided even further. Very complicated stuff. But here's the good news. Even though I know Mrs. Mack is so eager, she cannot wait to quiz you guys, I have here a little cheat sheet for you. Now, I don't know this is exactly what Mrs. McIntyre is going to cover, but I bet it's pretty close. If you look at the list, and I'm going to include this as a clip-on, I'll pass it on to Mrs. McIntyre. She can put it in her room. But, for example, we see autobiography and biography. I think we all know what a biography is. It's where you go and you study someone's life and you write about their life. Hopefully it's somebody interesting enough to read about, or someone maybe significant in history. An autobiography, of course, is a book all about cars. No, that's not true. Autobiography is a book where you write about your own life. When you get that book, the author has written about his or her own life. Fantasy story we covered, pretty much it has to have magic in it, and they give you some examples to the right. Historical fiction, this one can be interesting. I'm going to come back into the picture here. Historical fiction, I think Mrs. McIntyre asked me if 9/11 can count, if a story was set in that time period, 2001, as historical fiction? And my answer is probably yeah. It was a significant time in our history, and it even affected the world. So calling that historical fiction, I don't think is wrong at all. If somebody sets a bunch of characters in that time period in New York City and they happen to be there when the events go down, they're living through a historic time. So, sometimes history is hard to define, just like science fiction can be hard to define. We're never saying this stuff is simple, but in many, many cases, you can come very close to identifying the genre of whatever it is you're reading. And as I explained before, and this will be the last time I say this, it is actually more important than you think. Knowing the type of book you're reading, the type of story in your hand, gives you a massive advantage to understanding it. You can anticipate so many things that are going to happen. I like to read fantasy books. I know other students like to read those kinds of books. I know going in, I have to pay particular attention to the rules of that world because magic will be real. There'll be maybe creatures that don't exist here, but they'll be real there, and I have to appreciate that and understand what they can and cannot do in that world. If I don't get the rules of the fantasy world, I'm going to be very confused when I read the book and probably not like it very much. Okay, that's pretty much it. You got a good idea or a better handle, I hope, on the different types of books that are out there, the different genres, that nice French word that makes you sound so much smarter when you use it. And I hope it goes well in the quiz. And I think at this point, I have earned my cookies, Mrs. McIntyre. Be well, everyone.